just wanted to talk a little bit about psychoanalysis and African healing practices. And the reason why I want to talk about that is because I have two main concerns with psychology. I just realized that psychology has been dehumanized. And the reason for that is the pharmaceutical companies, as all psychotherapists in this room know. So psychology is becoming globalized. Psychology is becoming mechanized. So we are at the point where the world is hungry for something a little bit different, something that has a soul. So that is my one concern. The second one is that if you find a letter that Freud and Einstein wrote to each other, defining the role of psychology as that instrument that should control human beings' minds. Because during the First and Second World War, there was that need to understand why the human mind is like that, why people kill each other. And then psychology had defined the West, had that purpose. And us as Africans, we are victims of that, basically. Like our minds have been, in a way, controlled and changed and modified so that we can think in certain ways that are not authentic to who we are. So those are my two main concerns for this presentation that I'm trying to address. So, and it's obvious that there is that desire for the decolonization of psychology. It's a big movement. It's all over the world, like they call Indigenous psychology. It's all over. And it's time for Africa to bring something on the table and say, this is what we have, this is what we offer. So, and what we offer, as defined in the Journal of Black Psychology, is a psychology that works for the illumination and liberation of the human spirit. So that is what we believe in. And a psychology that respects people's culturally consistent lived experiences. That is another thing that we believe in. And it's also a psychology that focuses on love, justice, and balance, as we see in the Power of Might. So, because this is a broad topic, I'm not going to address all the Western psychological branches. I just decided to work on psychoanalysis as one representation of the Western psychology and psychotherapy. Because psychoanalysis is a little similar to African healing practices, but with a few differences that I will address later on. And I also chose to talk about one specific African healing practice so that I can anchor, I can really focus my point, my development of the message that I'm trying to share with you today. But before I go there, I also have some questions that guide my work. We've been talking for a couple of days now in this gathering that we have, and there's a question that keeps coming that I've been asking myself. All of us have a Western education. All of us speak Western language. All of us do basically everything we do in Western context. How can we then develop an African psychology? Is it even possible to talk of an African psychology? So this is really a big question, because all the concepts that we'll talk about will have to be explained in the language that is non-African. So how do we do that? I think it's a good question, but I think that I will not ask that question like that. I want to ask a different question that addresses the same problem. The question that I want to ask is, how can we connect our African knowledge that is already existent, and we know it is, within the Kemetic philosophy, within the Kemetic wisdom, is already there documented. How can we connect that to modern African healing practices? That is how we get the language we need. So, and I will talk a little bit about those concepts as I go forward. So, And we know, we're learning about the wisdom of ancestors. We know what they are, we practice them. How can we bring it here? And there's that talk for us clinicians and other psychologists and therapists here, that how do we adapt the DSM or Western psychology to indigenous practice like Africa, for example. And I'm asking myself, how can we adapt African wisdom to the West, to the world? How can we actually share that? Why don't people ask that question? So those are the things that I really want to address today. So the objectives that I'm expecting to meet is that I want us to a little bit learn about one African healing practice that will open the knowledge of how African belief system actually define the African personality. So the second thing that I want to also talk a little bit is about understanding symbolic healing processes. Because healing in Africa, as many of my colleagues here will agree with me, it has to do a lot with symbolism. How do we understand, how do we read the symbolic healing process? So, and the third thing is to show the relationship between psychoanalysis and African healing practices. Why? Because I want to show how psychoanalysis, Freud, who created, invented, or developed psychoanalysis, how it was influenced by the African wisdom, the African comedic knowledge that is there in the books, and develop his model of the id, the ego, and the superego. That is the reason why I'm trying to make the connection. And because we're in the West, so I wanted to use also a little bit of Western language so that I can make the case as an African. So the symbolic healing. We see there is symbolic healing. For you to have an idea, I really want you to picture yourself in an art museum. You go see artwork. You see paintings on the wall. If you have 100 people in the room, they will have 100 different ways of interpreting the picture on the wall. So there is not one single way. The artist will tell you that when I was drawing, I didn't know what I was drawing. So what do you see? Somebody will say, I see the face. Somebody will say, no, I see a head. Somebody will say, no, I see an animal. So it's how you interpret that. So that talks to something that goes beyond the brain. And I will address that later. Psychoanalysis that comes from the West has a way. Researchers have shown the human brain. I'm not going to dwell on that. The left, rational, the right, emotional, and everything. What I really want to talk about at this point is the cat. I want us to focus a little bit on the cat, the image of the cat.
Fat cat.
Yeah, I want us to look at that cat. To explain the Western mindset, why we're struggling to articulate African wisdom in the Western mindset, it's just almost impossible. And we see why. We in the West are taught to arbitrarily create symbols. We create the letter C, and then we create the letter A and the letter T. And we learn how to pronounce that. So there is the visual learning, and there's the sound, how we sound, cat, and then there's the image. So when I say cat, the brain automatically wants to see what represents the sound and the letter that I'm reading. So all of that is abstract, but it's being made concrete because we need to basically develop our digital brain. So cat, sound, letter, image, and then when I say cat, I already automatically represent that. The African way is not like that. Africa does not operate like that. It's the other way around, because this model is called centripetal action, where you have to do all this work. But the centrifugal action is, I see the cat, and as a trained healer and a trained viewer and a trained African, this cat can expand in my brain and have many different connections and relationships. So it will not necessarily mean what it means here when you're using this side. It can mean a variety of things. So it's a little bit technical, but we'll understand it better when I move on. So when we see what I said, that Freud was inspired by some African concepts. The id that everybody knows, and I don't want to really talk about, like where we have our repressed feeling and everything, was already known thousands of years in the Kemetic wisdom as the ba, which is the soul, which is the emotional part of personality. It was already known. The ego, which was already known as the ka, which is the rational part of the human being, the personality. It was already known. Freud was inspired by that. Then the superego, which is the authority that says you should not do that, was already known as the non. So the unconscious was already known as the Ndut. The Ndut was a text, the African religious text that was found in the Pharaoh tomb that explained the reality of the afterlife, what happens in the world of the dead. Because in the African context, they're not dead. They just transition, they were alive, but in a different form. And the Ndut talks about that. And Freud did not understand very well that concept and developed the personal unconscious, but Jung understood the concept and developed the collective unconscious. Because that is what Ndut means, the collective unconscious. So those things were known thousands of years. So I don't know why we say, oh, we cannot articulate African wisdom. We can if we actually do research in already what exists and translate and talks about the African wisdom. As long as we agree that ancient knowledge in Egypt was and is ancient knowledge of Africa. Because when we talk about Egypt now, people just see the Arabs that just moved in there. They were not Arabs, they were African. And they are the people who invented mathematics, science, and all those things. They did that. So, and the texts are there. We have to sponsor Africans to do research in the hieroglyphs, you know, the ancient Egyptian writings. There's a lot of wisdom there. Who does research there? Westerners are the ones who do research in the hieroglyphics and talk about that. Egyptologists do not agree with Kemetic people, because Kemetic people are saying that African are the ones that created that knowledge. And Egyptians know they have another version. So why don't we do that, those researchers? So that's one thing that I'm really trying to talk about. We have the knowledge. What was left? What was left when Freud and his likes took those words and transformed and misrepresented them was the Sia, which is the spirit, which is essential to African. The Sia, which is the mind, sorry. The Act, which is the spirit. So those two combined actually explain what Africa is all about. The Sia, the mind, that's where the representation and everything else happens. The Act, the spirit, is the essence of basically everything. They just could not put that in their psychoanalytic, Western, centripetal way of understanding the digital mind, where you have to relate. They just couldn't translate that. They just forget to use it. So us as Africans need to go back there and study those things. The math, which is the ultimate virtue of African. Love, peace, justice, balance. That's all we're about. As a therapist and psychologist, a balanced mind is a healthy person applying the principle of the math. We have the knowledge. We just need to go back and do the research and see how to connect the knowledge that our ancestors in Egypt already created, wrote, and documented, so that we now translate that, because it was in those days, into modern African healing practices. So, the Ndut now is a ritual ceremony practiced by the Lugu people in Yoruba community in Senegal. So, it has 7 stages that when the person is sick, has some symptoms, the person will go see the Ndut, and the Ndut will will meet with the family and do the diagnosis and see what the person has. So what I want us to pay attention to is to see the connection between, you see most of the slides, that there's that connection with the land, the dust, the land. There's that thing that you cannot believe here because you have to sit in your comfort chair here and then the therapist is there. And there is healing that happens. If therapists here can just take their client and say, take off your shoes, let go and walk in the dust, you see something happening there. So, and the set is the first thing. Gomar is asking permission to the spirit to begin the healing process. And then the healing process means bringing the whole community to begin to develop how to create a setting where healing can actually take place. The Ndut means to measure. The doctor, who is the healer, will now assess the patient, meaning aligning herself with the spirit, and every part that's being touched there means that the spirit will leave that part. Call it belief system, I don't know. The Bukutu. The Bukutu, actually, you bring the animal around the shrine where you tie the animal up, and then you put the patient, the lion, and then you cover them with a white sheet, and then there is a symbolic death there. Like this, the illness is supposed to move from the patient and transfer to the animal, symbolically, and then the patient will just bounce out of the white sheet and goes, symbolically reviving, coming back to life. So they raise the animal to be sacrificed. The ram is to build the temple, where you put all the parts of the animal and begin to eat with the patient and everyone. And then, this is the ultimate thing, the reintegration. Ultimately, you want to bring the patient back to the community. Because the patient is sick, because something was broken within the community. You will see the emphasis of community, dancing, trances. That's where healing happens. As opposed to the patient's there and the therapist over there and then doing what they do. So you see a lot of dancing connection with the land, the sun. You see a lot of dancing, prayer, and that connection with what makes us who we are, with dust. You see she's now getting ready to fall into trance. She's into trance, and then the healer is beginning to do her work. So the sister is replacing the patient because the patient couldn't make it that day. So to see how everything happens within the community. So those are just some, so she's already passed out there. And yeah, so basically, you see psychoanalysts who say, oh no, it's just like the unconscious happening. And then the patient had some introject, the values of the community, and then the healer would just do some kind of transference, and the patient kind of transfer, and then that's what the healing happens. In Africa, no. The spirit world is real. It is real. And there's that immediate knowledge of things that you cannot necessarily translate or explain. And then the energy, which is within, that friction that you can feel and experience and not necessarily articulate, is there. Community, number one. So, now, conclusion. Is there an African psychology? I'm sure we don't have much time to discuss that. But what I think is, we can only talk of an African psychology if we have clear theories, going back to comedic wisdom, clear methodologies, clear definition of our concepts, what they mean in our terms, clear discussion about cultural diversity, because people say Africa is very diverse. Who made the distinction? White people, right? Westerners. Because they made the boundary, physical boundary. I, Cameroonian, relate to a Nigerian, relate to my fellow South African there. I don't see any difference. Is there a global universal self? Do we want to fall into what we are saying that the Westerners are doing because they're globalizing the DSM? If, as an African, we create this African psychology, how will that help the world? Not only African, because we don't want to be reclusive. We want to be open and say that we have something to share with the world. So are we going to sin? Are we going to say, okay, our ways are better than the Western ways? That is something that we need to discuss. What does that really mean to be human from an African perspective? So, can we say that we can reclaim African healing practices and belief system? So if we posit that our healing systems are efficient, how do we translate that? How do we translate that? That it is efficient, it can actually work, it works, and then people can benefit. We need to think about that. How do we find a universal language? How we need more publication, peer-reviewed journals that really accept the kind of work that we do. Licensing agency, because all of us here need to go get agency licensing from APAs and other things, BBS and everything else. So we need to go through the Western model and then come here and sit and say we need to talk Africa. How about we have our own licensing agency and talk with the government that we do this research and license our own people? Because ultimately, when you're poor, you will not think about this. You will want to go do something that will give you a job. And then you come down here and talk about this. So we need to discuss those things. We need to teach. We need to create schools that will teach our wisdom. I've been in America for 6 years. I've never seen any African anything. Where are these? I don't know where it is. We need to teach that or create our own schools. I go to a school that was created by people from the East because they believe in their philosophy, California Institute of Indigenous Studies, and they promote that. They created that and they promote their philosophy. And I'm trained there. We can do that. So finally, what does it mean to be human from an African perspective? I'll just turn you back to the Ubuntu philosophy. Affirm one's humanity by recognizing the humanity of others, up for the preservation of life over wealth, and so on. Those are very important values in African philosophy. So what we take away from this presentation, that symbolic healing is a universal structure that involves healing symbols, where the trained person will just help the patient identify those mythic symbol, and manipulate them. Then the emphasis on the community over the individual is being very clear there. So finally, illness is not accidental. It is the result of bad relationship with one or several members of the group and the difficulty to follow the rules that safeguard the interests of the community and the ancestor. That is the bottom line. Thanks. I don't know if I have 2 minutes for 1 or 2 questions. Yeah.
I want to first commend you for your presentation. I love everything the way you broke it down. I was able to follow you along very well.
Thank you.
I was wondering, it may be more of a technical question. So the photos that you have, were you there, or were you there to witness the healing process, and after the reintegration of the patient? I would like to know more about how you know that the patient has successfully reintegrated.
Yeah. So I was not there, but it happened in 2001, and the person resourced for that is the Professor Omar Ndut. He's teaching at the Fan Institute in Dakar. So what I did was, I was aware of that when I was still in Cameroon, in the symposium, World Symposium on Psychology in 2001, I think, and that's where I was made aware of this practice, and I started following it. And my goal is actually to follow different African practices there so that I can pull out the theory and see how they actually do that, so I can develop a methodology that I can actually explain. So that is as far as this is concerned. How do we know that she's reintegrated, she's cured? Because the Ndut doesn't lie. What happens is when they meet the Ndubka, the healer would identify if the illness necessitates the Ndut to happen. If it doesn't, they will send the patient to the Western hospitals. So from the onset, you have to be clear that this is something that requires the Ndut. And it's only applicable to women. That's another thing that I didn't talk about. Because in 1747, there was that epidemic that was killing women in Senegal. Nobody knew what was happening. So, and they went to hospital, whatever, there wasn't a hospital, but there's just no way to. And the wise man, the ancestor, whatever, elder, came and said, we need to do X, Y, Z to help those women, to stop that. And that's how the Ndut was developed. And it's proven to be very, very effective. And then they make the difference if we need to do that or not. So if it doesn't succeed and she's not recovered, that means that the Ndut did not do a good enough job to diagnose if we needed a Ndut. Yeah. Yes?
Could you speak to issues of attachment and development of object relationships in your scheme?
Yeah, well, there are many ways to see attachment here. Attachment here is not necessarily like it's defined here in the West, like the child is attached to the mom and then develop these things and that. And that happens there. But it happens in a broad level. It's a community level. Like you are attached, I'm here as an African from Cameroon. Everything I do here, every way I think here, goes through the whole process of where I come from. Even if I want to do something, I'm like, okay, what will my tribe think of this? Or now that he's in America, he already lost his values. So I'm not alone here. I have my tribe in my head. So I'm attached to that. We're going to talk about attachment. And what was the second thing? Object relation. Well, object relation, evidently, is what? It's that theory that contradicted Freud, who was very narcissistic in things, that say, no, the child wants to mimic the mom, not because the child wants to suck the breast because the child is sexual, but because the child wants companionship, because the child wants to see himself in the mom. But that's all I've been talking about. That girl was sick and she basically, quote unquote, sinned against the community. So she wanted to be reintegrated in the community. So the symptoms and all that were symptoms of being disconnected from the community. So it's about companionship, about being one. Yeah, so we can talk about concept, but that's how it works.